Welcome. This lecture is going to help us conceptualize Middle English's grammar. This is going to be a long and convoluted lecture, so stop and take a break, replay it, do whatever you need to do to kind of grasp the information. Let's begin. First, we want to look at grammar's functionality and its evolution from Old English. Okay, so we had grammatical gender in Old English. This is a difficult concept for modern English speakers because we use biological gender and don't assign gender to inanimate objects. While in the Middle Ages, this concept became more complicated for native English speakers as well. You'll remember from the previous lecture that French was having a major influence on English at this time. Well, a key component of the French language is grammatical gender. However, they only use masculine and feminine, no neuter designations. Moreover, grammatical gender designations in French often conflicted with designations in English, so that made it confusing or awkward for French and English speakers at the time. The line was blurring, after all. And so in this period, we eventually see the grammatical gender is no longer a linguistic factor. So biological gender becomes more important, and we can finally use feminine pronouns in reference to the noun woman. Isn't that exciting? This significant linguistic shift accompanied a decrease in inflections of adjectives, nouns, and demonstratives. English inflections were leveling off and getting closer, or at least more recognizable to modern speakers. Middle English, I should point out, is not taught as a foreign language as Old English is. So, two important changes happen when English stopped using as many inflections. First, the increased use of periphrasis, which means that instead of communicating a lot of information in a single word's inflection, we're now relying on separate words that express grammatical relationship. And two, the development of a more fixed word order. It was getting closer to modern English, but inversions were common in verse, so it's hard to tell exactly how much syntax was becoming standardized. By the mid-14th century, pre-verbal negatives were omitted. So for example, in French, one communicates negatives with two parts, ne pas, as in je ne sais pas, I don't know. In English, one portion of the negative was left off. With the decrease of verbal inflections came an increase in periphrasis with verb forms. The auxiliary or helping verbs be, do, and have came into use, and three additional verb forms appeared: the future tense, the progressive tense, and the modal auxiliary or modal subjunctives. The modal subjunctive was formed by using modal auxiliary words like could, might, and others on the list at the bottom of the slide here. Thee, thou, thy, and thine, we think of these as sort of substitutes for the word you. But during the Middle Ages and start of the Renaissance, they weren't interchangeable. Thee/thou was used to address someone familiar or of a lower social status. Ye/you were used to address people of upper rank. Ye/you was more formal. The distinction is like that between French familiar tu and formal vous. So it would have been common to hear a master call his apprentice thou, but a peasant wouldn't have used thee or thou for a lord. A lot of linguists have noted that we might expect husbands to refer to their wives as thee, while wives would call their husband you, but we don't see record of this. For clarity's sake, thou was the subject form and thee the object form. We see these terms used properly in Shakespeare's Sonnet 18. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Thy and thine were used as possessive, like modern your. Knowing when to use thy or thine was like knowing today whether to use a or n before a noun. Thy and thine followed the same rules. So, for example, we would say thine eyes, but not thy eyes. As you've already heard, there was a significant influx of French vocabulary at this time, and earlier linguists thought the French influence was the cause for many of the grammatical changes. But we know today that's not the case. In fact, we see that medieval and modern French contain many of the same grammatical principles, which means that French wasn't grammatically impacted by the exchange either. Now we notice that some scribes would impress French or Latin writing conventions on English texts they copied. But this wasn't significant enough to cause dramatic linguistic shifts. The primary way that French influenced English was through lexical borrowings. So let's shift gears a bit and talk a little bit about dialects of Middle English and efforts to standardize the English language. Linguists break down the Middle English dialects into 5 regional varieties, which closely related to Old English dialects, which makes a lot of sense. The 5 dialects were Northern, Western Midland, Eastern Midland, Southern, and Kentish. When I say that there were 5 distinct dialects, that doesn't mean it was impossible for people from Surrey to talk to people from Liverpool. That meant that you could tell a difference in accent and that some words were likely confusing. It could have been challenging, certainly, but it wasn't like trying to communicate between 2 unintelligible languages. And there was a continuum within each dialect, so not everyone spoke the same way and maintained all the same conventions. To put it in modern terms, this is like encountering someone from the Deep South who doesn't have a Southern accent. Kind of like me. I'm from the Deep South, but I don't sound like it. At least I don't think I sound like it. Tell me if I do. Anyway, there were significant differences in pronunciation and some lexical differences throughout English, and we get something closer to an English standard at the end of the Middle Ages. In the Old English period, we saw the emergence of a written standard in West Saxon, but in the Middle Ages, we're moving toward a spoken standard as well. If we look at written records for medieval England, we will see that dialect in the idiosyncrasies will show up in the writing as well. This makes it easier to date and locate Middle English works than the same practice for Old English work. Another written shift at this time is that the scribes of the Anglo-Norman court were also Normans, so that they were trained in writing French and Latin. They didn't all have a perfect working knowledge of English, especially given the variety of dialects. When they translated works into English, they would introduce Romance spellings and conventions by analogy. These changes meant that the way words were spelled didn't always match up with the sounds, and we'll talk more about orthography and spelling when we get to the early modern period. Just like West Saxon became the dominant writing style of Old English, the East Midland dialect rose to prominence in the Middle Ages. It was kind of a happy medium between the extremes of super innovative Northern dialect and really conservative Southern dialect. The East Midland area was the most populous and wealthiest region of England, and so a lot of business was being done there, specifically in London. And in London, people weren't just doing international business, but they were purchasing goods and trading with merchants all over England. So this dialect spread throughout England through business transactions. The East Midland area is also where we find Cambridge and Oxford, and some scholars suggest this educational boon also made the area's dialect more attractive. So now we question, how is the vocabulary changing as a result of all these contact zones and influence from Old Norse, Latin, and French? Well, we know that a lot of French words entered English vocabulary, and eventually the Old Norse borrowings finally made their way into writing, but how did that change existing English synonyms? Well, a lot of Old English words were lost and others other duplications resulted. So both words were kept, but one changed slightly in meaning. This duplication meant that we developed different levels of synonyms: formal, learned, and popular. Even though French was on the decline, a German merchant in 1375 sent a letter to his colleagues to warn them that they would need a French interpreter when they came to do business in London. Another surprising effect of all these contact zones is that 15th century English writers started to incorporate unusual or uncommon Latin words into their works. When they felt that English didn't have a word to express their meaning, they would pull from Latin. This was also a stylistic move meant to augment the status of English and make it seem just as dignified and worthy as other European languages. And we'll talk more about this technique when we get to the early modern period. Let's switch gears again and talk about the Great Vowel Shift. This was an important change in the English language that made Middle English and early modern English start to sound closer to modern English. When we talk about the Great Vowel Shift, we're talking about a change in the way people pronounce vowels during the Middle English and early modern period. In 1909, Otto Jesperson described the shift, but we're still searching for an explanation. It was an unconditioned shift, meaning it applied to all long vowels equally. All long stressed vowels were raised in articulation, or basically started emulating other vowel sounds. Vowels that were already high on the pronunciation scale became diphthongs. In other words, the vowel started to sound like a combination of two vowels in a single syllable. Examples of modern diphthongs are coin, loud, and side. So what caused the Great Vowel Shift? The short answer is we don't know. One of the funniest scholarly responses to this issue that I've seen was in Robert McComb's Globish. He says, "Every subsequent history of the English language has paid lip service to this jargon, but no one has or ever can have a definitive explanation for this change in the sound system of English. All we can say with any certainty is that approximately from the 1450s, increased social mobility and economic prosperity was encouraging new literacy among new classes throughout the kingdom, and a marching change in articulation." It feels like he's exasperated, and I'm kind of amused by that. Anyway, we can't be certain of the exact chronology of the change. We're pretty sure it occurred in waves from the 15th to 17th centuries, but something that complicates researching the Great Vowel Shift is that changes in pronunciation weren't recorded in the spelling system or orthography of Middle English. So words would continue to be spelt the same, but the way people pronounced them changed. We can deduce how the pronunciation changed based on rhymes, commentary, and other indirect means. Similar shifts occurred in other Low West Germanic languages. So what were some of the changes? First, it eliminated the distinction between long and short vowels. The difference between long and short vowels at this time was actually not based on pronunciation like in modern English. Long vowels were long because they were pronounced longer than short vowels, and it also confused English spelling a bit. In other words, spelling started to become fixed due to the printing press, but many people would still write phonetically because they didn't know how to spell every word. As a result, we have a lot of different spellings recorded at this time for the same words. Here are some examples of how pronunciation shifted. Okay, so if you want to take a minute and glance at this slide to get the pronunciation examples. There are several visual representations to help you conceptualize the Great Vowel Shift on Blackboard, and there are some in your books and on Google. You can find them everywhere. Okay, under 15 minutes. That's great. That was a lot of information. Listen to this slide again. Call me, email me, stop by my office if you have any questions. I hope you have a great, great day.